Welcome to the Jali podcast. I'm your host, Melyssa Barrett. This podcast is for those who are interested in the conversation around diversity, inclusion, and equity. Each week, I'll be interviewing a guest who has something special to share or is actively part of building solutions in this space. Let's get started. Dr. Jessie Lamarre Andrè earned her PhD in human sexuality education from Widener University. She earned a bachelor in women's studies at the Pennsylvania State University. She went on to earn her MSW from Temple University, followed by her master's in education from Widener University. Dr. Andrè has worked in various capacities within the field of social work. She began her work doing advocacy for people impacted by intimate partner violence. She has worked with various nonprofit organizations in Philadelphia and Camden, implementing various modalities of therapy with families and adolescents within the juvenile justice system. Dr. Andrè specializes in working with individuals with bicultural identities. Their approach to health aims to empower folks to identify and interrupt maladaptive behavioral patterns that disrupt or negatively impact their physical, mental, emotional, and sexual wellness. Dr. Andrè has practiced social work internationally and is passionate about helping future social work practitioners develop a worldview framework, understanding, and respect regarding different cultural aspects of human behavior. She has a number of research interests and specialization, including the experiences of first-generation Afro-Caribbean women navigating sexuality and their bicultural identity as a result of immigration, sexual health disparities amongst first-generation individuals, mental health concerns among first-generation individuals, curriculum writing for culturally competent, comprehensive sexuality education, sexual culture and immigration, sexual migration, queerness, immigration, and cultural identity, sexual-related issues in therapy, including sexual trauma, pleasure, identity. She is currently residing in France, but also teaches in the United States. So please help me welcome Dr. Jessie Lamarre Andrè. Awesome. Well, I am so excited, Jessie, to have you here. Jessie Lamarre Andrè.
Sounds great. Yep.
I gotta keep practicing. My tongue needs practice. But I'm so excited to have you here to talk about, your perspective, because there's so much in what you do that I think people should be aware of and should, not only, and I think your focus not only on the people you serve, but to the practitioners that are out there serving them as well, which is fabulous. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about, how you got to be where you are and what you're doing over in another country right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we should probably start at the beginning. So my father, I was born in Haiti. My father in the 80s, at the height of the HIV pandemic, a little after the CDC made that horribly misinformed and racist 4-H club, he migrated and immigrated to the States, and we joined him afterwards. And that was kind of like my first experience really being in another culture, being in a space where I wasn't understood, and the way that I talked, the things that I believed were vastly different from those around me. And that experience of otherness and being reminded that I was an other, and people not really taking the time to understand where I was coming from. Starting in school, moving throughout my life really kind of got me into the work of the impact that culture, by nationality, by cultural identity, all of the different ways that kind of like plays on a person. So fast forward to grad school, the first time I'm at Temple, it's my first class. I, decided that I wanted to be a social worker. I submit my first assignment, and I had an instructor ask me if English was my first language. And I proudly said, no, it wasn't. And she said, well, you write like it. And she said, I would recommend that you, take some time off and come back. This program might be a little too academically rigorous for someone like you. And mind you, this is a social work professional. They are licensed. They're in this field because they want to help people. And she said that to me, and I remember just kind of being so shocked at what I was hearing. And the whole entire time I was in that class, when I was answering questions and writing papers, and talking, doing role plays about how we would help someone in the situation, I was always being corrected. And it took a while for me to understand that the way that she was correcting me was because she wasn't seeing the fact that I wanted to honor the person and the culture that they're from, and let that inform how I practice with them. And so that really kind of like got me started in really thinking about like what cultural competence means in social work and in the helping professions. Because the word culturally competent services is like this key it's like this hot topic word that we throw out, but do we really know what it means, right? So is it enough to just say, oh, well, I learned a few key facts about working with someone that is from Pakistan, or, I have observed people from this community and I see what is important to them, right? Like culturally competent services has now been reduced to facts about someone's culture and not really looking at how their culture, how their experience is informing their behavior. And it's informing, all of the things, and it should inform how we practice with them and what kind of aid we give them. So I mean, like, that's really what got me started. And I have been really lucky enough to have had different opportunities to take some contracts overseas, and kind of like putting myself in these different cultures, I get to see that in action, right? Absolutely. Like I am an interloper. I've come into, the UK, I've come to France, I've come to Morocco, trying to provide aid, but am I providing aid with the lens that I think aid should be given? Or am I providing aid, and am I supporting it? Am I practicing social work through what someone from this culture needs, and what does that look like? So that's kind of me and my work in a nutshell. So I rambled a bit, but I think
it's fabulous that, you're literally living what you're doing. Which is also informing you as you serve your clients, which is awesome. I think probably many of us wish we had the opportunity to help people in a way that also really is central to who we are and how we do it based on so many global perspectives. So you're actually like taking those perspectives, and then it's informing your practice in a more culturally competent way. Which is awesome, because I know you do a bunch of things, not only in mental health and emotional, but you also get into sexual wellness and how couples culturally communicate, if I have that right.
Yes. And And so that, it's quite interesting because when I was doing my PhD, and a lot of people say doing PhD is often doing me work, particularly in the social sciences, right? That you have, even some people in the STEMs that, they're really passionate about a topic and they decide to dedicate 10, 20 years of their life, pursuing this degree. And for me, myself, being a person that was born in Haiti, grew up in Haiti, and then had to live some parts of my life in the United States, I found myself in a relationship with a French person, like with a Frenchman, right? And apart from the common language that we have of speaking French, there are so many other different ways cultural differences show up in our relationships, and we don't take the necessary time to really dissect what that means, right? First example is how we communicate with each other. Not just words, right? Like beyond the language stuff, right? Because the language part is just at the basis of it. But how we communicate in the essence of what a conversation between couples look like. Some conversations that are being had, right? Because I have some friends here that when I'm talking about my and my partner's relationship, they're shocked that I'm actually having these relationships with him, or having these conversations with him. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, but why wouldn't I have these conversations with him, right? This is my chosen life partner. And the idea of certain things being off topic to partners, not because you want to keep it from them, right? But that's just culturally acceptable. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that, right? Like the simple conversation of, like your siblings and their sex lives, right? And I remember an awkward conversation of one of my siblings had called me and, had asked a question about cunnilingus. And I was like, here's the answer to that, right? And my partner turned and looked at me and said, why you talk to, like, you're giving that information, like you talk to your siblings about that? And I said, well, of course I do. Why wouldn't I want my siblings to be having pleasurable sex? And this is a younger sibling. And I'm like, I would want them to come to me and ask for information because I don't want them to go and get it from pornography. I want them to go get it from somewhere that's responsible. And so, and I had posed a question. I'm like, well, don't you and your siblings talk about sex? And the resounding no, right? And not no because, well, it's awkward because of family. No, because of that's just not something that you do. And so I followed up with some of my other friends and I'm like, do you guys think this is a weird conversation to have? And I got the resounding no, we don't talk about this. And so these small nuances, even if it's among friends, right? So how does that play, like how does that creep up in a sexual relationship? Because love is not all you need. There are other things that kind of factor into making a relationship work. And so, so all of these like different cultural dynamics of how we view relationships, what we think relationships should look like, what a healthy relationship looks like. All of those are like at its basis are linked in culture. And these conversations are not being factored when these couples are seeking therapy.
Well, and what's interesting is, I know probably everyone as a parent is also probably thinking about their kids and how they access information. And, you want them to have accurate information. You want them to understand, but it can be a difficult conversation to have, especially when you may not be comfortable in your own sexuality, in discussing those things. So.
Yeah. And I think this is where I am looking to the future and the younger generation to start normalizing these conversations, right? Because I think what's been happening is we're comfortable in ignorance in the sense of if we don't talk about it, then, it's okay. And we'll only need to talk about it if it comes up, right? So a conversation about certain issues, important issues, is like we're waiting until it's too late to have these conversations. Whether it be about, okay, so from your culture, you're experiencing a social worker as someone who takes babies, right? And for me, in my culture, what I know a social worker to be is this. We shouldn't be waiting until the last hour to have these conversations and to have these frank conversations, whether it be about, cultural differences or sexual identity, sexual experiences, all of these things, right? Like where we have adopted let's not talk, we don't talk about it, and are comfortable in that silence and that ignorance, and then are shocked when we get the outcome, which is people who engage in behaviors are doing things, and it's not for they're engaging in harmful things or in maladaptive behaviors, or clinicians or social workers practicing unethically, right? Like we're not having these conversations and then are like shocked at the outcome.
Right. Well, and I mean, you talk about some of the cultural differences. So can you talk a little bit about, maybe some of the differences that you've seen between, the United States and other countries, in terms of just how, couples connect, aside from communicating on the specifics? But are there other things? I mean, I think we were even having a conversation about what was it? I want to say like serial killers, or what was it about? Yeah. I'm trying to remember now.
Yeah. There's a family annihilation that occurred in India, and it was shocking because three generations of a family basically annihilated. Right. And that is not something that exists or that's happened in that culture, because it's a collectivist culture. The reason why this murder happened, and the person that committed this murder actually had some roots in the United States. And so when he essentially murdered his family, people were talking about how it's the disease of the West, right? That you have a child that is so independent that they're not thinking about, the community, that they have put their own desires ahead, and pretty much as a result of seeking their own, I guess, individualistic desires is at the cost of the family, which kind of allowed them to think it was okay to, kill the entire family.
Wow, that's so sad.
So I think from the different experiences that I've had in looking at social work across the globe, starting within the United States, there has been a culture of really not understanding what social work is. Starting first with what exactly is a social worker? People are shocked to find out that in order to claim the title, it's a licensed trademark. So in order to claim the title social worker, you actually have to have a graduate degree from a social work, an MSW, and you have to pass a licensing exam, right? So once you pass this licensing exam, depending on what that looks like in your state, you can actually take on the title social worker. However, from the 60s, early 70s, when we saw welfare reform changing and the landscape of the United States changing, social work has been synonymous with baby snatchers, right? Mm-hmm. Social workers have been synonymous with part of the system, part of the reporting system that was separating families. During the 90s, when the United States was going through the crack epidemic, right? The social workers would come in when they were making the welfare check, and and they're the ones that would tip off or report that they suspected mom or dad was using crack cocaine, thereby separating families. So the history of social work in the United States has veered from what originally it was meant for, which is we have a chosen profession where people are dedicating themselves to aiding and supporting the community and strengthening families, right? So now from the 60s on, there been kind of like a change in the image of social work, but social work is still synonymous with the system. Whereas in India, right, a social worker is someone that is providing the community access to resources. So during the at the height of the COVID pandemic, a whole bunch of us, were called to India to help the small remote villages kind of like pass out, supplies, really learn about COVID and how to support themselves. For me, myself, I was absolutely prepared to have the door slammed in my face, to have kind of a combative stance of the people in the community that I was trying to help, right? Because unless they were coming to me, meaning they're like, hey, I'm volunteering for treatment like I saw in the United States, I was used to combative and people not trusting me. Whereas in this community, a social worker was someone that was actually helping the people in that community access resources. So if you wanted to know how to apply for a birth certificate, if you wanted resources on where to get Lysol, where to get hand sanitizers, the social worker was the gatekeeper of the information to the community. And I saw that replicated also in other countries, which was interesting. And so someone had said, they're like, okay, could it be that in worlds that are developing, in nations that are developing, right, the actual social worker is at its root doing what the definitions do, right? Like they're actually assisting the community. And why is that often lost, in other worlds? And then I saw Japan. So in Japan, it's quite different in the sense of what social workers represent, right? Like they're there, but they're not necessarily, it's the support as well. But it's not synonymous with all of these horrible things that we see synonymous in the United States. So it kind of got me to thinking, where did we go wrong in the United States, right? That the helping professions have been kind of synonymous with people that are tearing apart communities. And it all goes back to how we in the United States perceive people who are visibly different than us, right? So the others, and what that looks like when we actually try to help them, right? Like in these homogenous societies, the other, there's not really a lot of definition for other, right? And so diversity or inclusion looks different. In the United States, there's a long history of racism, prejudice, discrimination, and that has not, in the 300 plus years that the United States has been around, there hasn't been much evolvement on how we see others in relation to ourselves and how we view difference, right? Like now we are moving towards a place where we're not seeing difference as a threat. We're not seeing difference as a deficit. We're not seeing difference as something that needs to be corrected and changed. That hopefully we're seeing difference for what it is. It's just different, right? And the helping professions has not really caught up to that because we're seeing difference. So if I, as a white doctor, have normalized being and existence as whitehood or whiteness, if I encounter someone that is different than that, my mind hasn't really figured out how to help and how to work. And therefore, if I'm not mindful, I might be perpetuating bias, and the person on the receiving end is sensing that they don't know how to help me. And by all of these things, right, now we're doing more harm than good. Now we are getting into that nasty cycle, which is these people can't be trusted because they don't know, they don't want, they don't know how to engage and interact with me. I just rambled, but I hope that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. I mean, and it's what's interesting to me is how much research you've done in so many different areas. I think one of your research projects or papers had to do with mental health among first generation individuals. And so can you talk a little bit about the kind of differences in that? And, certainly, I mean, even as we think about, racism in America and the trauma that comes from, and honestly, I was on a webinar not long ago and they were talking about the continued trauma, because it's not that we're actually past the trauma. We continue to have that trauma, kind of ignited, I guess, as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. So mental health within first generation individuals is actually one of my passions, because again, this is something that I have lived and I have seen. So for someone who decides to migrate, no matter, unless they left as a child, like as a young baby, where they have no conceivable connection to the country that they left, they're kind of grappling with two versions of themselves, right? The person that they would have been if they stayed in their home country and who they are. And a person who is a first generation immigrant, they are kind of adept in walking, like having 2 foot, like they're 1 foot in each part of the door, right? They have one leg and this leg and 1 foot in the other, and have gotten used to kind of like the balance of identity versus kind of the culture that the culture of their host country. So within kind of my practice and the work that I've done, even before I decided to open my own practice, I noticed a lot of first generation individuals talking about the toll that this duality takes on them, right? There's that. And then for some of the folks that I saw, contending with parents and a community that may not value mental health, right? That may not see the merit of mental health, or and when I say mental health and mental wellness, when you're thinking about someone who's mentally unwell, some of these individuals were like, well, I'm not crazy, right? And I asked them, like, what do you mean by crazy? Or I'm not mentally ill. What do you mean by that? Well, I don't hear voices. I'm not responding to internal stimuli. I'm not all of these, right? So they're looking at the visual, kind of like the extreme aspect of mental not wellness, and not looking at the fact of anxiety, depression, imposter syndrome, the toll that really navigating this dual world takes on a person, right? Mm-hmm. And the fact that we really don't know how to work with this population, because the research out there says, okay, they're here, right? Mm-hmm. But what the research is not telling us is, how do we work with them? What are some therapeutic interventions that are going to be helpful in working with this environment? What are some things that we as practitioners and clinicians need to be mindful of when we are working with this population, right? And that information is not out there unless you are talking to someone, a clinician who's lived it, or if you've lived it yourself, which I have, right? So I'm like, I know what might be helpful, and then trying to always learn new different ways to expand on that, right? Because again, we have, and this is what I mean by cultural competence in the work that we do, right? Within the first generation community as it relates to mental health, we have the information, the statistics on these are some of the things, this is what it looks like, but the practicality, the doing part of the cultural competence, we don't have anything for that. And the interventions that we're seeing, when they're getting that so-called, peer-reviewed or empirically based, empirically factual stamp saying this is something that is effective, when you're looking at who they tried it on, you're trying it on, white middle class families. How does that then translate to first generation, living near the poverty line family that's dealing with this issue? You want me to apply an intervention that has not been tested on them to see if it actually is effective on an already vulnerable population. And this is how we lose people.
Let's pause for a moment. We'll be right back. We were talking about the other day about trust and, because there's already a lack of trust between, when folks are doing experiments and research and, whether it's Tuskegee or otherwise. I mean, we could talk about Henrietta Lacks and a whole bunch of examples. But I mean, I think the challenge, there's such a challenge in creating that perspective and that, for people to be informed that way without someone like you who actually is traveling and working in it and really paying attention to the behaviors and the cultural dynamics. And so I think, I was just I'm not a therapist or a social worker or anything like that, but I was listening to, I think we were talking about, it was a webinar on like the Crown Act or something. And we had, I think Dove put it on, if I remember correctly, and they had physicians talking about the differences in how symptoms show up on dark skin versus light skin. And just the basics of what that looks like physically. So to me, I start thinking when you talk about the mental health and wellness, it's like it can show up so much differently. But how do practitioners even understand what those differences are when it comes to, different populations, different ethnicities, different cultural backgrounds? I mean, that's so difficult.
Yeah. So, and as I was listening to you talk, it kind of like brought back to me kind of my own experiences in that, and that distrust, that lack of trust that exists. And, we know why it exists. And so we're working to kind of change that. But right now we know it exists and it's impacting the work that we do. Mm-hmm. So within my MSW classes that I teach, there is a book that I refer back to, and it's called "And the Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down." And this book was actually based on real life factual chronicles of a family, a Hmong child, her American doctors, and these collisions of culture. Right. And so in this book, the social worker is highlighting their work with this child who has an illness and how the family's Hmong culture clashes with her American doctors. And when you read the book, if you are not a provider, you're like, there's absolutely no way this would ever happen in real life. And then I actually had it happen to me, right? And so I had, when I was working in Philadelphia, I started working with a client, and it was an 11-year-old child. And the 11-year-old child was hospitalized for psychosis and for responding to internal stimuli. Now, mind you, that kind of symptom, it's quite rare in people under the age of 18. Like, the symptoms of schizophrenia tend to not show up until early, like in someone's early or mid 20s. So the fact that we had a child that was responding to stimuli, it was quite interesting. So I go to the hospital, and within 2 minutes, I realized why I was the one that was selected for this, right? So this is a Haitian family. The mother spoke, she was conversational, but didn't feel really confident in her English. The father spoke absolutely no English. And the child, while they had been in the United States for, I think, 3 years, so, had really good grasp of English, was actively responding to psychosis. So again,